What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 12 surprising facts most people don't know about Joan of Arc. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, to English speakers, was a woman ahead of her time. Although she only lived for 19 years in the early 15th century, she made her mark on history. Joan led an army and inspired a nation during a time when women were regarded as second-class citizens. These surprising facts about Joan of Arc will give you new insight into the young peasant who helped appoint Charles VII as King of France and led French troops to massive victories against the English during the 100 Years' War. One of the most badass historical women, Joan rode into battle and drove fear into the hearts of her enemies, all while sustaining multiple near-fatal injuries. She tirelessly fought for her God and her country, and although she helped restore faith in France, she was tried by the Catholic Church and burned at the stake before she turned 20. Like many other saints, Joan of Arc's true legacy was decided after her death as stories about her grew into legends. Heretic or heroine, Joan of Arc was fiercely passionate and just straight up fierce. Her name wasn't Joan and she wasn't from Arc. The English changed Joan's name to Joan from her initials, Jehan. As for the misconception that she came from a place called Arc, that's another error of translation. She was actually from the French village Domremy. Her father's surname, d'Arc, was the source of the confusion surrounding her name. Joan's preferred moniker for herself was Jehan la Pucelle, which translated to Joan the Maiden. She chose not to engage in combat. While Joan of Arc led the French army to victory during the 100 Years' War, she didn't engage in combat herself. Her role was more that of a military strategist and a rallying figure for her troops. Joan's weapon of choice was her banner, and she chose to carry that into battle instead of a weapon. "I loved my banner 40 times better than my sword," Joan is quoted as saying. "To avoid harming anyone, I carried my banner by myself when I went up against my adversary. I have never killed a man." She bossed around knights. Like many teenagers, Joan had a pretty vicious temper. She would yell at knights who swore, skipped mass, or misbehaved. Although Joan didn't use her swords in combat, she did use them to chase off prostitutes who were traveling with her army, hitting them with flat side of her blades. During her trial, she said her swords were excellent for giving hard clouts and buffets. She might have had epilepsy. Joan began to hear voices and have visions around the age of 13. The same voices that would eventually tell her to lead the French army against the English and help establish Charles VII as France's king. During her trial, she said that when the voices spoke to her, she would often see bright lights. Joan also said that the voices would become clearer whenever bells were ringing in the background. Based on these symptoms, some medical experts believe she could have suffered from epilepsy, which studies have shown can cause auditory hallucinations, or some other neurological disorder. She survived several near-fatal injuries. Joan suffered many injuries. She reportedly fell from a siege ladder and once had a heavy rock thrown at her head. Luckily, her helmet blocked the blow. Joan was wounded in the chest by an arrow while the fort of Les Tourelles was being stormed. She applied some salve on the wound, and continued to lead her men in battle, which terrified the English. It's difficult to tell whether these accounts were exaggerated, but they were effective tools for intimidating the enemy. She found her sword thanks to her voices. One of Joan's voices told her to look behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine of Fierbois for one of her 4 swords. In a letter, she asked one of the church's bishops to retrieve the sword and send it to her. The bishops found the rust-covered sword, cleaned it up, and sent it to Joan. She had an amazing memory. Joan was born a peasant girl, and reading and writing weren't a required skill for a woman of her station. She was taught to spin and sew instead. That didn't stop her from achieving her goals. Even though Joan was illiterate, she was incredibly sharp, as proven by her military tactics. Her contemporaries often remarked upon her exceptional memory. But her lack of literacy may have hurt her in the end. Some historians have speculated that Joan didn't understand that she signed a document confessing to her crimes. She jumped out of a tower after being captured. When Joan was captured by the English allied Burgundians, she was imprisoned in a castle until she went to trial. During this time, Joan became so desperate that she jumped off the castle tower. It's unclear if this was a suicide attempt or a stab at an escape. However, she was recaptured, and was eventually delivered to the English to be tried. She wasn't burned for being a witch. Joan faced 70 charges, some of which included witchcraft, but only a few were dropped against her. The accusations that led to her being burned at the stake all dealt with her dressing as a man and believing she could talk to God. She stayed pious until the end. There is some disagreement about what Joan of Arc's last words were before she was burned at the stake. She probably said, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," and "Hold the crucifix up before my eyes so I may see it until I die," according to historians. She inspired imitators. After her execution, Joan's brothers began to dress women up as the martyr and would parade the young ladies through the country. They convinced people that Joan had managed to escape her conviction and had married and settled down with a knight. They did this for 6 years, moving from one town to the next, collecting gifts on their travels. She was eventually found innocent. At the behest of Joan's mother, Isabel Romee, Pope Calixtus III authorized a retrial for Joan to determine whether the initial trial was just and adhered to ecclesiastical law. The Church began investigations in 1452 and, in 1456, Joan was found innocent and proclaimed a martyr. Joan found out too late, but her mother made it through to see her daughter's name cleared. Jehanne la Pucelle, or Joan of Arc as she was known, was a woman who was far ahead of her time. Her short but remarkable life continues to captivate historians, scholars, and admirers all over the world. Though she lived just 19 years in the early 1400s, Joan defied the expectations of gender, class, and age by rising from an illiterate peasant girl to a military leader and national icon, becoming one of the most mythologized figures in French and world history. The tenacity, complexity, and remarkable legacy of Joan of Arc are brought to life in new ways by these 12 surprising facts. First, her name wasn't actually Joan, and she wasn't from a place called Arc. The English misinterpreted her name, which was originally Jehanne, and mistook her father's surname, d'Arc, for a reference to a location. She was actually from Domremy, a small village in the northeast of France, and she called herself Jehanne la Pucelle, which means Joan the Maiden. Another lesser-known detail is that despite her association with heroic battles, Joan never actually engaged in hand-to-hand combat. She preferred to carry a banner rather than a weapon, acting more as a spiritual figure and strategic leader. She famously said, "I loved my banner 40 times better than my sword," and claimed to have never killed a man. She still commanded respect and authority, even when she was in charge of knights, many of whom were much older and had more experience than she did. Her fierce discipline included scolding soldiers for swearing or skipping mass, and even chasing off prostitutes who followed the army, using the flat of her sword as a blunt instrument of chastisement. Starting at around age 13, Joan began to experience divine visions and hear voices, phenomena that she said came from saints like Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. During her trial, she described these encounters in great detail, saying that she often saw a bright light and heard the voices more clearly when church bells were ringing. Modern experts speculate that she may have had epilepsy or another neurological condition, though others maintain that her experiences were purely spiritual in nature. Throughout her time in the military, Joan also sustained a number of near-fatal injuries. She once fell from a siege ladder, had a heavy stone thrown at her head, which her helmet luckily deflected, and was struck by an arrow in the chest during the storming of Les Tourelles. Rather than retreat, she applied a homemade salve to the wound and returned to the battlefield, which struck terror into the English and further fueled her legendary status. One of the most mystical stories about Joan involves her sword, which she claimed to have been divinely directed to find. Her voices told her that a sword was buried behind the altar at the church of Saint Catherine of Fierbois. When she asked the church's clergy to investigate, they found an old, rusted sword just where she had described it. The sword was sent to her after it was cleaned, and it became one of the 4 swords she is said to have owned. Despite her illiteracy, Joan had an exceptional memory, which allowed her to memorize complex military strategies and engage in thoughtful theological debates during her trial. Many of her contemporaries noted her mental sharpness and clarity, though her inability to read may have played a tragic role in her downfall. Historians believe that she may not have fully understood the document she signed during her trial, which was a confession of guilt. This brief act of submission was later used against her. After being captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English, Joan was imprisoned in a castle and eventually became so desperate that she jumped from a tower window, injuring herself but surviving. Whether this act was an attempted escape or a suicide attempt remains debated, but it certainly highlights her despair at the time. Contrary to popular belief, Joan wasn't executed for witchcraft alone. Though she faced over 70 charges, including heresy and sorcery, the main reason for her execution was her insistence on wearing men's clothing, which she claimed protected her modesty in a prison full of men, and her steadfast belief that she had communicated directly with God, two things that deeply unsettled her inquisitors. Throughout her trial and up to her death, Joan remained unwavering in her faith. While there is debate about her exact last words, it is widely believed that she repeatedly called out, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," and asked her executioners to hold a crucifix up so she could see it as she burned at the stake. Her composure and piety in her final moments left a lasting impression on witnesses, including some of her enemies, who reportedly wept at her execution. After her death, Joan's legend only grew. In a bizarre twist, her own brothers took part in a scheme where they dressed other women as Joan and traveled through France claiming she had miraculously survived and was now married to a nobleman. For 6 years, they fooled people across the countryside, accepting gifts and hospitality under the pretense of Joan's survival. The true redemption of Joan's name came years later when her mother, Isabel Romee, petitioned the church for a retrial. Pope Calixtus III authorized the proceedings, which began in 1452. After years of investigation, the court concluded in 1456 that Joan had been wrongfully convicted and was, in fact, a martyr. This posthumous recognition couldn't undo her suffering, but it did restore her legacy. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint in 1920, and today she is remembered as one of France's greatest heroines and a symbol of courage, faith, and conviction. These lesser-known facts offer a fuller picture of Joan of Arc, not just as a mythical figure draped in armor, but as a real, complex young woman whose life was shaped by divine conviction, military brilliance, tragic injustice, and unwavering faith.